This lecture is about how the world affects us. We call that stress. If you haven't already, go ahead and open up the PowerPoint on stress. I want you to take a look at the first slide, and I want you to read each of these statements very carefully. You receive a promotion at work. Your car has a flat tire. You go to a fun party that lasts very late. Your dog gets sick. Your new refrigerator is being delivered. Your relatives stay with you for a week. Now, some of these situations we can very readily identify as being stressful. For instance, your car has a flat tire, your dog gets sick, your relatives stay with you for a week. But often people don't realize that the other situations can also cause stress as well, even if they are positive situations, like receiving a promotion, going to a fun party, or getting a new refrigerator delivered to you. The reason why all of these are considered to be examples of stress is because all of them involve change. Change is one of the most fundamental causes of stress, even if the change is good. In fact, among people rating their highest stressors, often those stressors are positive events. For instance, getting married or the birth of a child. We usually consider these to be positive life experiences, but they also involve change, and change is stressful. So don't assume just because a particular life event is positive doesn't mean that it is not going to come with a certain amount of stress. If you take a look at the next slide, I want to give you a definition of stress that you can use. Psychologists define stress as any situation that threatens or is perceived to threaten our ability to cope. Let me say that again. Stress is defined as any situation that threatens or is perceived to threaten our ability to cope. And that definition is very important because there are certain situations that obviously would be stressful to all of us universally. If we're, heaven forbid, in an accident or something like that, that is a situation that threatens our ability to cope. But the second part of that definition varies between individuals, a situation that is perceived to threaten our ability to cope. For instance, an example of that would be having to give a speech. For some people, they have no problem just getting up and talking off the cuff about whatever topic you give them. In other words, giving a speech is not perceived to be a threatening event. But for other people, an event like giving a speech would be terribly stressful. So in other words, the same situation can produce a very different response in individuals simply based on the perception of the event. So again, it's not just is a situation threatening to us, it's also do we perceive a situation to be threatening to us. And that can vary highly between people, and it's just something to be aware of. You may ask someone to do a favor or do something for you that you may not consider stressful, but that person might consider to be stressful, or vice versa. Stress has many sources, and there are 3 sources that I would like for you to know. The first one I've already mentioned is change. Change in your life is stressful, again, even if the situation, the change, is a positive one. So we can't discount the effect of a change in our life as a stress potential for stress. The next possible source of stress is burnout. Burnout is experienced when we try to reach a goal and we task our ability to do so. Sometimes people have burnout at work. Students often have burnout at school. So you're trying to reach and maintain the goal of being successful, and oftentimes you can't. Then you begin to perceive that you are being taxed in your ability to cope, and that's when we experience the sensation of burnout. And I'll talk more about that when we get to coping strategies later on. The other source of stress that I want you to know is conflict. According to psychologists, conflict can occur in one of three varieties, and they all start with the letter A, and they are combinations. So if you look on the slide, you're going to see the three types of conflict: approach, approach avoidance, and avoidance avoidance. If you take a look at the next slide, there is a description of each kind of conflict. The first one is probably the easiest one to deal with in terms of coping. This is the approach conflict. This is when a person must choose between two positive, or what we would call two appetitive alternatives. In other words, you have to choose between two good choices. So on the example that you see on the PowerPoint, you might have to choose between playing tennis or playing racquetball, and both are appealing to you. You might have to choose between pizza or spaghetti for dinner, when both are appealing to you. You might have to choose between two items of clothing that you like to wear. So again, approach conflict is probably going to be the less stress producing of the three types of conflict, because it involves two good choices, and you simply have to choose which one do you like better, or which one do you want to do more. The second conflict is a little bit more likely to produce a stress response. It is called the avoidance conflict. This is when a person must choose between two non-appetitive or two unappealing choices. On the example on your PowerPoint, you see a person may have to choose between being unemployed and taking a degrading job. Neither one of those options are good ones, and you have to choose between essentially two evils. Another possible avoidance conflict that can produce stress is having to endure the pain from a backache or having to undergo surgery. For some people, both of those choices aren't good ones, so you're left with having to choose between two things that you really don't want to have to choose between. Being stuck in an avoidance conflict is more likely to produce stress as you're trying to weigh the pros and cons of each situation. The last type of conflict is called approach avoidance. This is a special situation. In approach avoidance, you have one situation that simultaneously has advantages and disadvantages. In other words, the same scenario has pluses and minuses. We talk about pros and cons of the same situation. So for instance, on the slide you see one example where you have the possible benefit or advantage or appeal of going out on a date with an attractive person, but at the same time you must deal with the potential disadvantage of being rejected by that person. Another example of an approach avoidance conflict is investing money. The potential benefit is that you get returns on that investment. Of course, the potential disadvantage is that you lose the money that you invested. So one of the things that I want you to be able to do is to look at a description of a situation and be able to identify it as either an approach conflict, an avoidance conflict, or an approach avoidance conflict. Any one of these types of conflicts can produce stress, although like I said before, the approach conflict is probably going to produce the least amount of stress compared to the other two. If you go to the next slide, I want you to take a look at what our stress response is. And I'm going to focus most of the remainder of the lecture on our response to stress. When we're looking at a situation and its potential for stress, first we look at what the situation is. So you see on the slide we have examples. A big exam coming up, a big date coming up, trouble with your boss, a financial problem. These are all events which would normally cause stress. The first step in our stress response is a cognitive appraisal of the situation. That is, what is the perception of the event. Now, the perception of the event is influenced by many factors, such as the familiarity with the potential threat, how much we can control it, and how much we can predict it. All of these will help frame our cognitive appraisal of the situation. What I'd like for you to do is take a minute to go to the next slide, and we're going to take a look at cognitive appraisals of situations. This system was first developed by a psychologist named Albert Ellis, and in Ellis's view, we have 3 steps in our cognitive appraisal of a potentially stressful situation. The first step is called A. A is the actual activating event. So like I just mentioned, you have trouble with the boss, a big date coming up, a big exam, or as you see on this slide, someone stands you up on a date that you really looked forward to. So the event is unchanging. The A step does not change. The event is what it is. What influences our cognitive appraisal of the situation is Ellis's next step, which is called B, the belief system. When we evaluate a potential activating event, cognitively, we are going to go in one of 2 ways. One way is to have what Ellis called an irrational appraisal. This means that your perception of the event is somewhat irrational and is going to lead to a negative consequence. So a person who is irrational about being stood up on a date would say something like, "This is terrible, I'll have a boring weekend, I'll never find anyone, I must be a worthless person." That is an irrational appraisal of an event. That is one belief system. The other belief system, according to Ellis, is much more rational. In a rational appraisal, we might say to ourselves, "This is unfortunate, but I will salvage the weekend. I will live. Someday I will find someone who is mature and dependable." So the B step, the belief system, is critical. If our cognitive appraisal is irrational, it is going to lead to a negative consequence. And of course, part of that consequence is stress. If we have a rational belief system, that is going to lead to a much more positive consequence and less stress. So if we back up for a second to the previous slide, what you're going to see are the 3 possible consequences of a potentially stressful event. Based on our cognitive appraisal, we're going to have an emotional response, a physiological response, and a behavioral response. The emotional response from an activating event comes usually in one of 3 types. When someone is exposed to a stressful event, the emotional response usually comes in the form of anger, anxiety, or sadness. Those are the 3 most common responses from an emotional standpoint: anger, anxiety, or sadness. If a person has an irrational belief system, it is more likely that he or she will experience more of these negative emotional consequences: more anger, more anxiety, and more sadness. The second category of responses is a physiological response or a bodily response. If you have an irrational appraisal during your belief system, during that B step of Ellis's, your physiological response is going to be one that involves increased autonomic arousal. So increased heart rate, increased respiration, increased sweating, all of those kinds of bodily fluctuations. In other words, you are going to have a much more pronounced physical response to a stressor than someone who has a rational belief system. If you're presented with a stressful event, even as a rational person, you may have some of these heightened autonomic responses. However, they won't be as intense and they probably won't last as long. The third category of responses or consequences is the behavioral response, what you do behaviorally. And I'm going to save that for a little bit later on. But people engage in many different types of behavioral responses to a stressor once their belief system is in place, whether it is rational or irrational. So if you skip past the cognitive appraisal slide that we already went through and take a look at the next one, you are going to see again those three categories of stress responses. The first one I've already mentioned is the emotional response. The second one, the physiological or physical response, I want to talk about a little bit more. There was a researcher by the name of Hans Selye who came up with the idea that when we are faced with a stressor, our body actually goes through 3 different stages, what he called the general adaptation syndrome. During our body's response to a stressor, we will universally see people go through these stages. However, if the appraisal was more rational, we will not see these reactions to such a great extent as we would if someone had an irrational appraisal of an event. But regardless, the first physical response, the first stage to a stressor, is called the alarm stage. In this stage, a person has those first initial responses to a stressor: increased respiration, increased heart rate, increased sweating, those kinds of things. When we have an autonomic response like that, that means that our parasympathetic system quiets down. So we don't see as much maintenance and repair in the body. We don't see digestion happening as efficiently as it should. So during the alarm stage, we are essentially preparing for fight or flight. That is our immediate physical reaction to a stressor. So I want you to think of the alarm stage as fight or flight. Later, Selye said that we go through a resistance stage. During this stage, the body will continue to maintain this heightened autonomic response. So we're still going on all thrusters to fight this stressor, and the body assumes, and we assume, that we can maintain this state indefinitely. We can continue to fight this stressor indefinitely during the resistance stage. So I want you to think of the resistance stage as more or less adaptation. The body is trying to adapt long term to the stressor by having these heightened physiological reactions to it. Unfortunately, after a while, the body is going to give out. Without the balance of rest, without the balance of restoration and repair, and all of those other things that our body needs, we will eventually reach a state of exhaustion. The body is finally going to give out. It cannot maintain that resistance indefinitely. During the exhaustion stage, we may see the physical consequences of the body trying to deal with a stressor. You may see things like heart problems. You may see things like ulcers and other gastric problems, because while the body was engaging in fight or flight, remember, those other systems for repair and maintenance were kind of put on the back burner. So we weren't digesting food as well, for instance. The body wasn't clearing out fat and plaque from the arteries like it should be. So we actually can see a host of physiological consequences from trying to maintain that resistance stage. The body is eventually going to give out during exhaustion, and this is where you see the increase in stress-related diseases, and even more commonly, just illness. When the body enters the exhaustion stage, our immune response decreases. That's why it's more likely when you are encountering a very stressful event or something that you've had to deal with long term, you might finally succumb to being sick. I've seen for years students are most likely to get sick during finals week because the stress of all the work in the semester has finally come to a head and the body just shuts down, especially with having to write papers and studying long hours. The body eventually says, I cannot put up the immune response anymore, and students are much more likely to be sick during finals week. That's an example of exhaustion at work during this general adaptation syndrome. The last response that I want to talk about is the behavioral response. And we just group these in a category of coping strategies. So this is the third piece of consequences, the third piece of our response. We have an emotional response to stress, we have a physical response to stress, and we have a behavioral response to stress. So if you take a look at the next slide, I want to first share with you what psychologists would consider to be constructive or good coping strategies. This is a pretty long list, and this is what any therapist would encourage clients to use when they are faced with stressful situations. These are in no particular order. The first one is active coping, and this is simply doing something constructive to head off the source of stress. If the stressor is something at work, then you should tackle it head on by doing something constructive to deal with that source of stress at work. So that's simply what we mean by active coping, doing something to address the problem. The second constructive coping strategy is emotional support. This is getting emotional support from other people when you are feeling sad or anxious or angry, looking to others to help soothe those emotions is always considered to be constructive. So you should not seek out someone who is going to antagonize those emotions even further or get you even more stirred up. That is not the kind of person who is going to be a constructive source of emotional support, but someone who can help you work through the emotions. Another constructive coping strategy is instrumental support. This is when you ask advice from someone who has been through the situation or a similar situation. So it could be a trusted friend, coworker, parent, whomever. But instrumental support is when you're actually asking advice from others who have been through a similar situation. Positive reframing is when you take a stressful situation and try to see the good in it. You try to reframe it in a positive way. This is a skill that comes very naturally for some people. Some people can easily look at a situation and say, well, at least this, and this being something positive. So, well, at least, it could be worse, this could have happened, or here's the benefit that you got out of this situation, even if it is a bad one. That's positive reframing. For some people, it does not come naturally, but it is something that can be learned, especially in therapy. Planning, pretty self-explanatory as a constructive coping strategy, where you make plans to do something constructive, or you make plans to find emotional or instrumental support. Having a plan is a good step to constructive coping. Humor. Time and time again, a good sense of humor has been found to be a strong buffer against the emotional and physical responses to stress. So having a good sense of humor, being able to put the stressful situation in a humorous light or finding the humor in it can often be constructive. Sometimes simply acceptance of a stressful situation, especially a long-term one. For instance, having to care for an aging parent or having to care for a child with disabilities. Sometimes simply saying, "This is what I have to do in life," can be constructive because it allows for you to let go of some of the negative emotions that you may feel by being put into this stressful situation. And the last one that has been shown time and again to be a constructive coping strategy is religion. Being able to turn to religion, some sort of higher power or spirituality, in other words, to be able to give yourself over to that, to ask for help in that way, can also be a constructive coping strategy. Of course, with every constructive coping strategy, we also have not so good coping strategies. And that's what you're going to see on the next slide. We call these poor or non-constructive coping strategies. Probably the one that is most commonly engaged in is denial. Denying that this stressful situation exists. That does a person no good because the situation doesn't go away. So denial is considered to be a very poor coping strategy. Another poor coping strategy is substance use, whether it be alcohol or drugs or any other kind of substance use. That, again, is just a form of denial or a form of escapism. It doesn't allow you to tackle the source of stress head on, and you're simply using it to delay having to deal with the source of stress. Two other poor coping strategies are self-blame and self-distraction. In self-blame, you blame yourself for the stressful situation, and in doing that, you cannot move forward. If you are the cause of it, you really don't see yourself as also being the solution. So self-blame is very commonly engaged in, but it is in no way effective in finding a solution for the stressor. Self-distraction is when you engage in other activities to avoid the source of stress, kind of in a way to ignore it and hope that it goes away. So self-distraction can be in the form of playing lots of video games, going shopping, whatever it might be. It is just a way to avoid having to deal with the source of stress. The next poor coping strategy that I want you to know is a very fancy term for a very simple concept, and that is behavioral disengagement. Behavioral disengagement is a fancy psychological term for giving up. So if you decide to give up in a stressful situation, you can say, "I'm not giving up, I'm simply behaviorally disengaging from the situation." Although behavioral disengagement may sound better, you're still giving up. Giving up is not an option because it does not lead to any kind of solution. Now, often we can be in a situation where we know the best solution is simply to walk away from it. This is not what we're talking about here. This is when you are in an actively stressful situation and you simply decide to give up tackling the problem, but the problem is not going to go away. So this is not a constructive coping strategy. The last poor coping strategy is venting. And I often get questions from students about that because students will say, "But I thought venting was healthy. I thought venting was good because it prevented a lot of the physically negative consequences. In other words, if you can get some of it out, you'll feel better and your body will respond better." Well, in psychology, venting would be okay if it was followed up by one of the constructive coping strategies that I just mentioned. So if you vent for a few minutes but then you make a plan, or you vent for a few minutes and then you seek instrumental support from somebody else, that's okay. But when you vent and that's all you do over and over again without then using a constructive coping strategy, you are no closer to a solution for that stressor. So simply venting without following up with anything constructive is not a constructive coping strategy because you're just going to keep coming back to the situation where you need to vent, then you're back in the situation and you vent again and again and again. The situation itself will never change because you never engaged in any constructive coping strategies to help make that change. So venting in and of itself is not considered to be a constructive coping strategy. So hopefully from this, you've learned about some of the sources of stress, you've learned about our stress response, and you've learned about the consequences emotionally, physically, and behaviorally. And probably most importantly, you have learned how to effectively deal with a potentially stressful event, again by using those constructive, good coping strategies. This ends the lecture on stress.